All right, we're going to talk about atonement models now and think through various ways Christians have tried to answer what seems like a pretty basic question. Why did Jesus have to die? And then a second question, what did Jesus' death accomplish? It's worth noting here that unlike, say, with the Trinity, there's never been an ecumenical creed written that establishes a meaning or meanings for the atonement. There are smaller groups of Christians that have outlined what they think it means, but nothing on the scale of, say, the Nicene Creed. Many Christians will hold together some of the models that we're going to talk about, many privilege one, but keep a few kind of in conversation. Some are adamant that there is an understanding you must have. They're willing to live with some others, but they really think that there is one that is absolutely essential. So I'm going to go through and talk about these. You read about some of them already, so this will be another explanation. And particularly at one point, I will disagree with your author a little bit on an interpretation, or at least present another interpretation. Okay, the first model of the atonement was probably the one most used in the early church. Some scholars would say that it's the most used for really the first 1,000 years, and it was the model of a ransom. Some people talk about this as a financial image model. So in this model, Adam and Eve become bound to the devil in the fall. Right? They've given themselves over to the control of the devil. Humanity then becomes enslaved to the devil, becomes enslaved to the devil's reign of death, becomes enslaved to the devil's reign of sin. What happens in the atonement is that God convinces the devil to accept Jesus as payment, as ransom. The devil's very excited. Well, he's got these, crummy people, but now he can have Jesus. Well, who wouldn't want that trade? So Jesus pays the ransom. But because Jesus is God, he's not able to be bound by death, so doesn't remain under the dominion of the devil. And if you're hearing noise out there, I don't know if you can hear it or not, that's my son going up and down the hall, not some fiendish, devil-y thing going on for kind of mood music, although if you wanted to think of it as that, go right ahead. So Jesus pays the ransom. And the devil is basically fooled and can keep Jesus dead, and so loses Jesus and loses humanity. Place where you might actually see one possible outworking of the ransom theory is if you've ever read the book, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or seen the movie. So in this story, there is a young boy named Edmund who ends up in a magical kingdom ruled by a white witch who is bad. She makes it winter all the time. She left the kingdom of Narnia and moved to Minnesota at some point in her life. Anyway, she is very nice to Edmund at first and gives him this candy he likes, Turkish Delight, and he pledges loyalty to her, but she turns out to be a cruel mistress. Aslan, who is I think it's fair to say Jesus figure in the book. The author didn't always like that, but I'm using this as an atonement model, so we're going to go with my reading. Goes to the White Witch and says, well, will you exchange? Will you give me Edmund and you can have me? And the White Witch is very excited because Aslan is the son of the great lord. She can kill him and it will kind of secure her power. So she kills Aslan, but then Aslan resurrects. He comes back to life because the White Witch is incapable of killing him. And again, Edmund is safe, Aslan is free, the White Witch has nothing. One of the challenges directed against ransom theory, and we'll talk more about this challenge in just a minute, is a pretty basic question, which is, so is atonement directed to the devil? I think it's probably fair to say that most people in the early church who talked about ransom theory were using it in many ways as a metaphor. There was kind of a description. They weren't really interested in getting into the nitty-gritties of who owed who what. But the way that it can sound, and some people could move it in this direction was it sounded like God owed something to the devil, and that's going to be a problem for many folks. Um, there are also people who kind of wondered about the ethics of God tricking the devil. Some people would not worry overly much about that, but some people thought it was beneath the dignity of God to trick even the devil. So that brings us to a thinker named Anselm of Canterbury, a man who began to rethink this model of the atonement, the ransom model. He famously wrote a book called Cur Deus Homo, or Why God Human. And in that book, Anselm thinks through a series of questions related to Jesus' death. So, what do people owe God? In other words, what's the human problem? The question of why can't God just forgive us? Why is the atonement necessary at all? How is Jesus' death salvific? What did it do that no other death could do? Why not just a good person? Why does Jesus have to be God? And what does Jesus' death do to humanity? So someone died. What does that have to do for anybody else? So we're going to look at these briefly. The book is set up as a conversation between Anselm and Boso. It's kind of hysterical. So Anselm says things and Boso basically says, "Oh, you are so smart," or "I completely agree with you," or in this case, "I cannot contradict you." I wouldn't necessarily recommend setting up papers this way, but it is kind of amusing. Okay, so on sin, how does Anselm understand sin? Anselm says that if an angel or man always rendered to God what is due to him, he would never sin. And Boso says, "I cannot contradict you." So Anselm says that to sin is the same thing as to not render his due to God. To sin is not to give God what is due to God. And what then he goes on to say is that what we owe to God is complete obedience, that's what God wants, and God expects, and God should have from us. It's what we owe God. Then the question becomes, so why not just forgive, right? So we didn't obey God, we sinned. Why can't God just say, well, whoops, well, try something else? Anselm has an answer. Let us go back and see whether it is fitting for God to remit sins by mercy alone, without any payment for the honor taken away from him. So I do not see why it is not fitting. And then Anselm says this: if sin is thus remitted unpunished, he who sins and he who does not sin will be in the same position with God. This is unseemly for God. In other words, Anselm says this is a question of justice, and justice matters in the world. It shouldn't simply be that people who sin and do terrible things and people who, like in theory, Jesus never sinned, have the same status before God. What kind of justice is that? What kind of universe is that? Do you really want a system in which there's no recompense for people who do bad things? So then Anselm goes on. So why does Jesus have to be God in this scheme? So what Anselm says is no one but God can make satisfaction, because for Anselm, all human beings have already failed. We've not given God what is owed to God. So we're out. We can't make recompense, because even if I started today to be completely obedient, I would still not be completely obedient, because my previous life before this was not completely obedient. I mean, I'm pretty good, but I've messed up here and there, so I wouldn't be good enough. So Anselm says only God has not disparaged God's honor. So only God is good enough to do this. But it's humans who owe God honor. God doesn't owe God honor, humans do. So there has to be a God-man who, being God, can render perfect satisfaction, and being human is the one who owes it. So, in other words, for Anselm, we owe God complete obedience, but we failed. Jesus renders complete obedience to God in his life. He's completely obedient. And then he voluntarily submits to death. This for Anselm is really important. Jesus wasn't forced to die by God. Jesus does this voluntarily. And because it's voluntary, It's meritorious. Jesus accumulates merit for doing this. If you want to think about it this way, this is extra credit. Like Jesus got 100% through his life, and now by dying voluntarily when he didn't have to, he gets all of the extra credit there could ever be. And it's infinite because when God does something, it's infinitely meritorious. For Anselm, this means that God's mercy answers God's justice. There has to be justice in the world. God has to say no to people doing bad things, but it's God who answers the call of that. So it's God's mercy answering God's justice. And some people want to say that what Anselm does is actually to avoid the notion here of punishment. God isn't punishing Jesus because Jesus isn't required to die. Jesus accepts the death that comes to him, and then that's meritorious. Your author does not like satisfaction, the Anselmian idea here. And part of the reason is he doesn't is because he, like many people, point out that this isn't biblical language. Anselm isn't using the metaphors in the Bible. And they sort of think it makes God sound like a mob boss, right? This creature up in the sky who's really concerned with his honor, and are you giving him honor? Other readers, though, of Anselm see this differently. First of all, they see Anselm engaged in a particular kind of intellectual project. He's trying to make sense of why Jesus had to be human and explain it in kind of rational terms. So he's making a decision about not using biblical language. They also point out that Anselm has a real concern about ransom theory. He's trying to give an account of the atonement that doesn't make the devil a key player. And they say God isn't a mob boss. God is being as such. God is the creator of all things. Transgressing God isn't wounding God's ego. That's not what Anselm is saying. Transgressing God is to transgress how things actually are. It's to go against the way of the universe. And yeah, when people do that, it needs to be attended to, or else there's just moral anarchy. So multiple possible readings here of Anselm. Shortly after Anselm gave his theory, someone else, a man named Peter Abelard, proposed another model. This is the exemplar model. And in this model, Jesus' death is not directed either to the devil or even really to God, but to humanity. According to Abelard, our problem isn't that we are in any way separated from God or owe God anything or have any problem with God. Our problem is that we know we've sinned and we're really embarrassed and actually afraid of God because of that. It's kind of like if you've ever had a dog who, I don't know, goes potty in the corner, and then you come home and the dog is hiding in the corner, in a different corner, like scared because he knows he's done something wrong. Well, that's kind of how Anselm sees humanity, that we're scared dogs in the corner because we know we've been bad. According to Abelard, what the death of Jesus does is frees us to love God. The death of Jesus is an example to us of how much God loves us, that enables us to turn back to God and see God as the God of love. So now we're able to love God, which is all God wanted in the first place, simply our love. God didn't need to die to satisfy anything. God died so that we would be able to love God freely. Some people have a problem with the exemplar model, and one of the pieces of challenge to this is that they say that it underestimates evil and what objectively needs to be fixed. So folks will say, well, sure, we are somewhat scared of God, but that doesn't really address how bad evil is. There's serious problems in the world. There's serious problems with humanity, and they're not just that we're a little bit scared of God. It's that we have done bad things. We've violated justice. We've hurt other people. And that simply saying that we just need to turn around to God and feel better about ourselves doesn't really objectively change anything about the world. It doesn't take justice seriously enough. It doesn't take the need to right what has gone wrong seriously enough. Finally, the penal substitution or legal model. This is related to satisfaction theory, but uses a different set of images. Oftentimes when people talk about this, they talk about it as something that occurs in a courtroom. So we are guilty before God. There's that language of guilt. God is the judge who has said we are guilty. Jesus comes and takes our place, is a substitute for us. We deserved the wrath of God, the guilty pronouncement. We were going to hell for that. But Jesus decides to take our place as the guilty party. God accepts Jesus' death in our place and then gives to us what belonged to Jesus, which is life. Now, at its best, people will point out that this does a couple of things. It really does acknowledge that there's something wrong with the world and something wrong with us, that there is real evil. Also, in the way that it's formally worked out, it's still something happening within the triune God. So in bad penal substitution, God seems to be kind of cajoled or coerced by Jesus into loving us. God is a stern judge, but Jesus is a nice guy who gets God to let us off the hook. People who support penal substitution will point out that that's not what the theory is trying to say. This is still an action of the one triune God. God is both judge and God is the substitute. And that's different than Jesus having to make God love us. Here's a famous way of understanding penal substitution. The cross is the lightning rod of grace that short circuits God's wrath to Christ so that only the light of his love remains for believers. So we deserved wrath, but that wrath goes to Jesus. We get the love. There are, of course, challenges to penal substitution. One of them is, do we need to appease God? Does this make God sound like God is up there angry at us? And is that a fair image of God? Now, again, people can go multiple ways on this. Some people would say, well, don't you want God to be mad at evil? I mean, shouldn't a just God and a loving God be mad at evil? But some are very concerned that it makes it sound like God's first orientation towards humanity is one of wrath, and that only then changes again because God is cajoled. Some people worry that it's too objective, meaning it makes the relationship between God and humans sound contractual, so that Jesus has paid this price. That means we're off the hook, and then I can kind of do whatever I want because Jesus paid the price. They worry that it doesn't give a lot of motivation to living a more sanctified or righteous life if you think that Jesus has fulfilled the terms of the contract. So it's almost for some folks too objective. A more modern concern is whether or not it underwrites what some people call the myth of redemptive violence. This is the idea that violence is what redeems us, that violence is necessary for redemption. And in the American context, people talk about this with slavery, with the Civil War, and with lynching. Very briefly, Frederick Douglass, former slave who wrote his autobiography, talked about watching a Christian slave owner beat a slave, and as he did so saying, by stripes you are healed, as if whipping was somehow redeeming this poor woman's soul. Historians have suggested that in the Civil War, both sides, North and South, began to talk about violence itself as redeeming the nation. The South from the tyranny of the North from the sin of slavery. And that both sides used this idea of redemptive violence to justify huge tolls when it came to battles. Allowing generals to use battle maneuvers that simply slaughtered people on both sides. And again, historians say that part of what might have been going on there is this idea that violence redeems, and so all of those people who were killed are simply helping the redemption of the nation. And then finally, lynching. A scholar named Don Matthews has argued very eloquently that one of the things that happened with racial lynching in the United States was this idea that violence redeems, and part of redeeming the nation here, making the nation white and for white people, involved the necessary deaths of black people. Now, I want to say there are certainly people who support penal substitution who would oppose all of these things. They would oppose slavery and um, battle tactics that killed people without a lot of concern. They would oppose lynching. So this isn't that penal substitution necessarily underwrites these things, but it's a question about whether the focus on the necessary death and the violent death of Jesus um, can underwrite political practices that are deeply problematic. The final image I want to talk about or model is the Christus Victor. Some people talk about this as the military image. It's related to ransom theory, and it's really a more modern view of ransom theory. It gained a lot of popularity in the 20th century, although we saw it in one of the hymns that we looked at, and it's actually a favorite way that Martin Luther talked about the atonement. Christus Victor, though, doesn't really talk about paying a ransom to the devil. Rather, it talks in more cosmic terms, emphasizing that in the fall, humans became bound to sin and death, not here personified as the devil, but as forces bound to sin and death. And that what happens on the cross is that Jesus undergoes the bondage to sin and death, but then in his death and his resurrections breaks those bonds and thus liberates people from sin and death. Sin and death just lose their force because Jesus has broken the bonds. People who use this image will acknowledge that the world still looks pretty bound by sin and death. What they'll often compare it to is World War II. In World War II, there was a famous battle, right, D-Day, where the Allied troops came to Europe and started their liberation of Europe. And what a lot of people say is, like, at the point of D-Day, the war was over, right? That successful battle meant that the Allies would win. But there was still a year or more of war left. There was still fighting left to be done. And for the people who were still occupied by Nazi Germany, it was a very real occupation. But the Nazis had lost their power in the sense that it was clear they were not going to win. And so here the idea is that Jesus has made it clear that sin and death ultimately lose, even though they still have some kind of last powers here on earth. There's a famous icon depicting the Christus Victor, Jesus coming out of the grave and breaking the power of sin and death. The challenge to Christus Victor is people wonder, does it underplay the individual need for redemption and our own personal complicity in sin? So they worry that its cosmic language sometimes makes people talk about systems that are sinful or the ways that death controls us in a kind of it controls all of humanity, but it allows people to forget the ways that people personally are involved in sin. So some points to ponder. The Bible has multiple images related to the atonement. Many Christians have a dominant image, probably today 2 of the most dominant, I know that's 4, but 2 of the most dominant are penal substitution and Christus Victor. Some people have a non-negotiable image, one that they just say is like, this is the image that you really have to hold. If you don't hold that, you've just missed the point. And it's worth considering whether or not you accept any of this, how different images shape belief and practice, particularly as that practice does manifest in politics. If these are images that are related to your tradition, it's worth thinking about which ones that you've heard, why you think in certain images and not others. But again, whether you accept any of the images, it's worth thinking about how they might form people who, say, vote or who think about issues related to structures or war or violence or any of those things. And that is all we have for this week on the atonement. I will see you next week for Thomas Aquinas. Woohoo!